Hello and welcome to Fireside Chats with Leo Rodman, featuring your host, Leo Rodman.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Leo Rodman, your host, and with me today is Olga V. Mack. Olga, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, Leo. It's good to have a conversation with you. I'm Olga Mack. I am CEO of Counseling CLM and VP at LexisNexis. Today, I'm building a future of law at LexisNexis. My company was acquired about a year and a half ago. I am a tech lawyer by design and proudly have practiced law for about 15 years before I ran away with building the future of law. So super excited to be here and to have this conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much. What do you think some of the top ways you're currently using AI at work, and how could other people use those?
Well, that's a big question. I think for the purposes of this conversation, the most relevant experience that I've had is with Law.MIT task force on ethical uses of generative AI. And as part of that, 5 of us have conducted numerous workshops and conversations around the United States in various places, such as Stanford and MIT and various other industry conferences such as ILTUB. And in the process, we have had conversations about various ethical concerns when it comes to generative AI and have encouraged the members of our communities to submit comments for a data set that essentially inventories everything that could possibly go wrong in an effort to educate the community and to prioritize some concerns that are particularly problematic, and over time develop tools and methods and frameworks to help lawyers to practice better.
So when you mention ethical AI, lots of things come to mind, and people have different opinions about what ethics might mean. What does ethics in AI mean to you?
Well, in the context of law, ethics has fairly specific and fairly well-defined meaning. There is a model code of conduct, and there are state-specific versions of it that basically have been adapted with some usually minor changes. So when it comes to lawyers' ethical obligations, things like confidentiality, things like upholding the law, various types of fiduciary duties, those are not sort of very debatable. Those are code that are part of your license. And should you not follow that, you will be disbarred, which basically means you won't be able to take economic advantage of your opportunity to practice law. So in the context of practicing law, ethics have enough of a sort of defined meaning. It doesn't cover everything that AI brings to the table, but it definitely has a head start about the definition.
So you mentioned that you're working on some frameworks. If you're allowed to talk about it, what are some of the basic tenets of these frameworks?
Yeah, and I've actually published quite a few things on law.mit. There are a couple of things that I've been pondering about. One of them is the duty to supervise. That duty is pretty clear in the model code.
With humans, right?
Well, it's really interesting. I've written a couple of articles about what that means. I think initially it sort of grew from this apprenticeship system and did apply to junior lawyers. But over the last few decades, that actually has evolved to vendors. It have even evolved to sort of various parts of technology, and has been applied in sort of privacy and various other things. So that duty has been expanding. It is fairly well recognized, and many lawyers have been supervised or are supervising someone. So very widespread. So the fact that that duty is with us does not change the fact that the how of it is actually not as clear. And I usually, when I explain to folks why, I invite them, whether they're lawyers or not, to think back on their career and look back and realize that their career is really full of random acts of supervision. Some of them are better than others. There's nothing about being supervised or supervising that is natural. It's a learned skills. It is not usually taught in college or law schools. Many of us sort of released into the wild, and then here's your duty to supervise, go do it. And in our minds, there is no framework, there is no approach, there is no definition of success, there is no measure of delta between where you are and success. There is no guidance about how to bridge that delta. And that's about humans. And so when you meet your colleagues, whether they're lawyers or not, over drinks one day and talk about their career, they'll tell you various stories of luck and bad luck that usually could be reduced to random acts of supervision. And some of us are lucky, supervised well or supervising well, and others are sort of casualty of lack of teaching that skill. That is humans. That is one-to-one supervision. And a lot of things could go wrong. Now talk about AI. It is not that hard to imagine that the bar associations will extend that duty to supervising AI. There are duties of competence, technology competence, and there's a well-established duty of supervision. And the question is not really, do I have a duty to supervise? Because I think the answer to that is very clearly, you do. The question is really, how? And that is not clear. And so it is my invitation to various bar associations to actually provide a little bit more guidance on how to define success of supervision, how to measure the gap, how to close that gap. How do you know when you are a more or less good supervisor of AI? And I think that's going to be very context specific, and it will require mental frameworks so that folks can be equipped to have intelligent conversations on the subject.
Now, you mentioned the idea of supervision, and that makes it sound very one way, like all the responsibility is on the supervisor. Do you think that also software companies and vendors also have responsibility as well to be supervising and improving their AIs?
So the short answer is yes, it is. And I can get sort of analogized to what's been happening in the analog world. AI is essentially comparable to heavy machinery.
Right.
It is not that different from a tank, I guess, in some ways, or a sharp knife. And when you deal with a heavy machinery, it takes basically the operator and the manufacturer to make sure that public is safe. So I think what we just discussed is essentially how do we make sure that the operator of this heavy machinery, because you can do a lot of damage with law, medicine, if you misuse AI, any profession really. How do operators of this heavy machinery are not in danger to themselves and society at scale? But there is a flip side. The flip side is manufacturer. The flip side is software producer who releases this heavy machinery into the wild. And hoping for the best is maybe not the best strategy. If you look at the way we dealt with heavy, dangerous things in the past, usually, at a minimum, you have some sort of disclosure, you have some sort of manual, you have some sort of fail-safe breaks, you have on and on educational materials. Heavy machinery may even require a license today. So there is, when you, for example, play with ChatGPT, which is the most widely used LLM, this thing is designed to please. And what pleases humans sometimes is, well, white lies. Anyone who has been married knows that to stay married, you don't have to always be confessional. In fact, sometimes it's useful to share white lies. That actually sort of makes the relationship go smoother. And this thing is designed to please us in the same way as my husband after 15 years of happy marriage. He tells me that my hair looks great every time, which I know is in fact a lie. But that helps our marriage because that reaffirms that he loved me in every state. And when it comes to something like ChatGPT, when it optimistically declares citations that do not exist, or tells you to do various practices that may have privacy or intellectual property implications on others, that's a heavy machinery that will have consequences. And the designers of this maybe need to curb its enthusiasm a little bit to make sure that it is not as dangerous as it is in this sort of pure form.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely run into that desire to please. I think one good example I've run into is a friend of mine ran an essay into ChatGPT and it told him he was like the greatest literary scholar known to man. And I was like, the essay was pretty good, but it wasn't that good. Try telling it to be more critical and not so nice. And it gave him, more meaningful and useful feedback. Um, I think that a big issue is going to be who becomes liable. So, for example, Microsoft has said that they're going to provide a liability shield or indemnify people who use Copilot. Shutterstock has said they're going to do the same for people who use their image generation. I mean, personally, I don't think anyone's getting sued anytime soon for using generative AI just because everyone is doing it. And it's not practical to sue everyone on the planet. But do you
Well, that's
think
not quite true. Copilot has a massive lawsuit on its hands.
already? Okay.
Yeah, well, that has been going on for a while, and ChatGPT and various others are part of various inquiries from the Federal Trade Commission. So that is separate from various copyright infringement lawsuits.
But that's the company being sued, not the end user being sued, right? Like, I don't really care if Microsoft gets sued. I just don't want to be sued myself. Do you think these indemnity shields, for starters, will hold up?
I mean, I see they will. I mean, look, I mean, depending how aggressively you want to enforce your rights, intellectual property does allow you to sue the end user, which is the reason why in most if you business to business contracts, if you procure a contract, it's not unusual for the end user to ask for indemnity. You are right that we've seen some quote unquote manufacturers of the software to say what stands behind it, and therefore will take care of any litigation or liability. That is, of course, a way to instill confidence and to encourage use without fear. All of that is true, but I would say there's a limit to that. Microsoft is a deep pocket, but it's not an infinite deep pocket.
Yeah.
And depending how aggressive you are as a litigant, you may have a strategy to pursue end users, to instill fear, to protect your intellectual property or principles you stand for. And you may demand a payout that even a company like Microsoft would feel the pain of. There is, of course, also a separate question. What are the default laws in the absence of contract? Because that usually determines the course of history. And historically, in the Industrial Revolution, for example, that cost of various injuries, for example, have been heavily absorbed by the population.
By the individual.
If you happen to be an early coal worker, or you happen to be operating a heavy machinery in early 1900 and you happen to be injured, it's probably wouldn't be your problem. We now have laws in place that protect workers from, for their conditions. and on and on. And I would say the arch of history is trending toward the manufacturer bearing at least some costs. And there is a very active debate in the legal community whether this should be a strict liability, meaning you don't have to prove intent for the manufacturer to absorb the entirety of that damage. So that question of who pays for innovation is a very active policy debate. I'm not sure I have a strong position. On the one hand, I do think that there's a very strong pull that I would like to encourage innovation. And so having companies bear the entire cost will definitely curb the innovation. On the other hand, I don't think it's right that individual end users or population sort of absorbs the impact. There are, of course, those are two extremes. There's, of course, other ways to do it. The government can subsidize and do various other things. So there are other ways to cut it, but that is an active debate of who pays for innovation. And I don't mean sort of day-to-day costs of employees and
but like
AWS. What I mean is the impact of that. And that's a big question.
Yeah. Well, that's about time for us. Thank you so much for joining us. Do you have any closing remarks you'd like to throw out to the audience before we go?
Well, this was very enjoyable. I'm really excited that we had this conversation. I think we all agree that ethical AI and doing the right thing is something that should be happening. I don't usually meet people who say, no, I'm really against ethical AI. Let's not do that. That doesn't usually happen. I think the big question is how. And the sooner we start answering the end how and designing frameworks for different purposes and training operators and holding folks to standards, the how is very important. And it will take the aspirational conversation with the good things to actually what it means to have a checklist and do good things, one good thing at a time.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much. I really appreciate you coming and speaking with us. Thanks to all our viewers and listeners, and hope you'll tune in next time. Thanks again, everyone.